recording, I'll just, because I have to do some stuff here, so I won't be able to stay. But I'd just like to say that we finally posted the proposal for the selection process of chairperson, admin, or whatever name we end up deciding. This was something that was discussed, I think, months ago. Initially, we had a first meeting on it. There was a lot of disagreement, and we did not really think through how selection process would be. So I think it really showed how this idea was a bit raw, at least in terms of taking it to the group. After that, it was not, I think it took some time before we got back to it. But a couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting that we also discussed also the research assistant position, but mainly we discussed the future admin. And there was some discussion on a proposal that I wrote based on previous discussions, previous ideas. And in the end, I think like we managed to, even with, I think, slight disagreements, we all agreed that it was a proposal that was worthy at least of putting it through a group vote. And this proposal is available in the STP English and the SPTBR. I just saw, Gabriel, did you vote on both of them? Or did
I shouldn't, sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah, I it's no problem, just because I think it's easy also to cross-check. But we will, this is a poll that will be up for, I think, a week. This is what we agreed upon initially. We saw that we need like a minimum 2/3 quorum between the active members. We figured, this is a rough count, but there are about 30 active members in the group. And we also decided on a simple majority. And it's very important, I think, to note that nothing here is set in stone. This is not a once and for all position. This is very experimental. What this position means, the selection process. So this is something that I think we can test. And if it fails completely, nothing will stop us from rebooting. I will say this because I think it is very important. If we do not arrive either at a minimum quorum, or if we don't, I think these are two different outcomes. If this is voted out, like if there are more disagreements and abstentions than agreements, I think that someone, I would suggest someone who is on the disagreement side should promptly take a new proposal, draft a new proposal, so it can be discussed in a meeting before we can vote it to the group, because this is something we've been delaying. So I urge people, if there is any disagreements, that this be taken forward so we can get this process, we can like not leave it where we left. If there is not a minimum quorum, I think we'll have to think and see why before we can decide where to go. Because, for example, if there are 19 people who voted and like 17 voted yes, I think like it's something that we can discuss as a group. But so we can avoid the quorum thing, I would suggest everyone to talk to members who they have like an open chat line or whatever, because I think this is important, and maybe not everyone is on the group. This will be a time where we will see who has the group muted, and it's fine. But I think that doesn't stop us from reaching out to certain people who we know would be interested in voting. So I think it's fair that we give this a chance, and I hope that we can go to the next step, please.
Well, you just said, first off, that was, thanks for that summary, and also just thanks for all the work you put in, Raphael, on this. So you did a lot. But interesting point, possibility is, I think we also talked about last time that if people don't respond, that's going to be considered a criteria for like not considering them active, right?
I'm in doubt if it was like, if
Or
they
is that
don't.
something we're still open question?
No,
I-
I think it's for the negative election part.
Yeah, it's only in the election itself. If you're selected, let's say falls on you, we try to contact you. Hey, do you want to take it up or not? And you don't even answer
Okay,
for a
okay.
while. That's the moment when it would be not the voting.
So
Yeah,
if we reach out to someone we're considering active for this election and we don't hear back from them at all, we're still considering that a part of quorum that we're missing. Because that to me is like, that's a pretty important, if like we're not hearing back from anyone at all and they're not like, I can't make it now, or I'll be back in a bit, it's just zero. I don't think we should count them towards total quorum. I think that's setting ourselves up to like potentially like have administrative issues rather than political issues.
I think that's a good point, but I think like we should hold off. I mean, I agree with you. I think we should take notes of people who are in that situation. And I think we can get back like in next week's meeting. If this is the case, I think we can address both issues. Like even if we pass the vote, I think we can take this into account. But I think this is something important, because if the person does not even answer and says, look, I can't vote, and I do think that's a big signal that we should take into account. I think we have currently in the STP community, is it like 40 people? 40, wow. Yeah, it's exactly 40. So I did a rough count. There are about 10 people who I think are like no-shows. But I think it's good. I mean, we can just like try and list them, people who like ignore us completely, and see what we do, because there's no point in keeping the illusion of a quorum with those people. Then if they want to come back, they will send a signal.
I just want us to kick Daniel Tutt out.
Yeah.
Just to get him to answer me and say, hey man, where have you been? What's up?
What's up, man? You know, you might.
No, I'm sure he will. Yeah, I'm gonna talk to him to make sure he does answer.
What if he's like, he just voted now?
Yeah, it would be perfect.
But I think that's it. I think, are there any other questions, guys, at least for this matter? No? Okay, guys, I wish you all the best. I have to leave now, but I've done my duty. But next week I'll be with you guys. So happy meeting for all of you.
See you, man. I was thinking, Hansel, you're the one with the chops for using the Figma when we use like with a kind of a power that slide version of it, right? Where it's not just the drawing board. Because I thought we could import, I'm not sure what we should do, like if we should write on top of what we already have, like that little map, or if we should import it into like a slide and add a layer on top of it, so we can add things. And because I don't think we can do that on the drawing board, right?
Yeah, I can start migrating to, yeah, it has to be, because this is like a jam and we have to create like a design. I think it's design file. I'm not sure how the copy and paste works across different formats, but by the way, are you creating like there's a way to create like a sort of like common, like a shared folder in Figma, and then we can like have a common places for all these files. So
yeah, we need to sort that out. I think that they are mixed right now, right?
okay. Okay, meanwhile, I'll try to move stuff to a new one.
Yeah, but at least that big thing. If I'm not sure what's the best way for us to edit it together. But yeah, so while we do that, I've locked, let me unlock the background. I'm not sure if you need that. I'm not sure if you guys remember. I think that last time we tried to do this of going over all the stuff we already kind of created, like, or made a bit more of a tradition or more settled ideas in STP. It was a bit of a messy meeting because we started we didn't know how to add those contents. It ended up being a mixture of things we had diagrams for, or schemas and things like that. And while we were trying to clarify what those schemas were and what's the basic meaning of them, something else happened, because we started seeing that there was kind of a structure to how they relate. And then we spent a long time playing with the big arrows. Okay, this goes below that. You need to know this, and things like that, right? So I don't think that was totally useful. And also we ended up mixing. I remember John was very kind of eager to add some technical issues and open questions, even before we managed to explain what the basic things were for people who were had arrived later. So so I wonder if how we should go about it today. Like, if we should briefly go over each one of the drawings, just to make sure everyone gets the basics of what they are about, and then we can start. If we can manage to already to do this, we could start to note down questions, things that are not clear, or things that are still open problems we don't know how to solve and to clarify. I remember Monica raised some issues that had that kind of feeling last time, like, how does this connect to that? How would you relate this? And we have no idea. So those things could start going into that map as well. Just trying to open here what Renzo sent. Did anyone manage to open it?
Sorry, that was unintentional.
What happened? Sorry.
I just dragged the diagram by accident, but then I put it back to roughly where it was.
Okay, no, I managed to open it online. I didn't manage to open it on a. So should I share a screen? Does that idea work for you guys? Like, to go over quickly over this, like we try to add little notes to each one of them, right? Explaining what that thing is meant to do, but perhaps it's not clear yet, and we could rewrite this if it's still unclear. Even if we don't do it now, we could add a note that it's unclear. And as we do it, we could already try to pinpoint perhaps things that are not, it's not just that it's not clear, it's that it's actually an open problem. We don't know how to do it, you know? So it also can help clarify different venues for discussions and so on. Is that a good method, do you think? So yeah, I'll do it this way, and again, just to remind everyone, this is the result of what we did last time. So once we started adding the little blue boxes with kind of basic stuff we've developed, we realized that there is kind of a sense of direction, in the sense that this upper thing is more fundamental and it's implied in the next, that it's more fundamental is implied on the next things in the arrows. So kind of, it's either more general, I wouldn't say like you need to know it to understand what follows, but it's kind of more general in some sense, right? John, you're adding, you're suggesting to add gray boxes for questions, right? What would the gray boxes be? Or is it a technical point? Just so we know how to add stuff.
Oh, yeah, I think it was like open questions / like technical questions, like
Yeah, I
less
think we should.
political philosophy stuff. But
Okay.
I don't really
Yeah.
care. I don't even like, you know, I think I left this meeting halfway through. I wasn't here for the arrows and stuff. So if I have no real attachment to
Yeah, no,
color.
just making sure we can do this together. So if anyone has a question, we know how to add it. So, but just
Yeah, I
using
think
that
that's
as a,
like, I'm down to do that. Yeah.
So yeah, so this is the first thing. It wasn't the first thing we developed, but we summarized it in this kind of idea that the proposition, what is organizational tritarianism, right? Why are these three arrows connecting these three things, which are defined in this particular way? The idea is that the organizational tritarianism is the proposition that to approach any phenomena from the organizational point of view means to treat these three aspects as ultimately being equivalent, right? So how are things composed? And we define this as how differences make up other differences. How do you combine things to make other things? What they interact with. So what differences can be made different? So if you have something that is in a certain way, what can you change? And what is intelligible to them? So what differences make a difference to the system? So these things matter, those things don't matter, right? This is our, I think that's, let me just steal the gray thing here. I'm not sure if anyone has another source for this, but I know one of the sources of influence for this was something coming from mathematics, which is called computational trinitarianism, even though we don't, the relations is very superficial, but computational trinitarianism is a thing in mathematics that a proposition that has a similar structure. It says, well, from the perspective of this theory, to treat proofs and to treat spaces and to treat programs, you know, as if they are kind of versions of the same thing. You're kind of talking about the same thing from different aspects. So we kind of stole that idea from there. It's not from Christianity or anything, you know. So yeah, just to make that point, even though it is meant to also rework Alexander Bogdanovs' theory, even though I think that the connections are not very obvious, right? So there's something we could discuss there. I'm not sure if this interests anyone in particular. Bogdanov treats things quite differently, I'd say. Like for him, the similarity is that organizations are not a particular type of thing. It's a way of looking at anything, right? So that's the similarity. The dissimilarity is that the definition of what it means to look at things organizationally for Bogdanov doesn't look like this very much. I think that if you wanted to translate one thing to the other, it wouldn't be that easy, like to write a short paper. How is STP's idea of organizational point of view connected to Bogdanov? I'm not sure what you guys think. If it is kind of evident, the connection, or if it is a bit obscure. So I don't know how to add other little notes like this.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious with respect to both this and the three modes is whether we can sort of like not derive but like justify like why, or like motivate like why these three perspectives, and also like why they are sufficient or complete in some sense. Like they feel sufficient, and like they're very, I just like them because they are useful. Like I can sort of like switch perspectives and get like new stuff out of it for any like given situations. Like by using it, I convince myself that it's useful. And also like, but it's funny that it's not clear like why, like one seems to be more about like thinking and logic, the other one interaction more about like doing and like dynamics, and composition something about like what's like the material and the sort of like part host, the mereology and so on. But it's not clear like, because they are not like, they're three different registers of their point of views, right? So I wonder if there is like some, either in philosophy or like some like argument that could sort of like justify them, or they're sort of like, we just like propose it and then use it and it's relevant. And I have this exact same question, although it's different, like for the modes. Like it would be nice if we could argue why they're like complete and the way they are, but
Yeah, the modes is easier, right?
it's
Because
easier because yeah, if once you map the social logics to logic, then it's like it's all there is. Like in history and in logic, these are the three things that appear. So like why not? Why would you need more stuff? And it's also not hard to say why they're sort of like irreducible to each other. So it's a bit easier case. Like before I would, yeah. The hard part is to map the modes into the logics, I think. Once you do that, then it's, I don't know, it feels pretty like
yeah.
complete.
What I would say here also, just for people who are arriving, is that definitely a thing that motivated this, though it wasn't clear, very obvious, is the way that Badiou presents, let's say, one of the benefits of category theory in his book, Logics of Worlds, where he does say, look at this structure, see how natural it is to move from an algebraic kind of operational side to a space topology side and to a logic side. So algebra, topology, and logic are very, very closely connected, right? And those three, because they are kind of the all there is to mathematics and logic, like geometry, algebra, and logic. So you could argue that there is something similar, but we never explored that, right? So again, I think that's also I mean, definitely things we haven't discussed very much. Another thing that I think it's interesting, I'm not sure if it interests anyone, but this is not about politics. Like we kind of don't say that this trinitarianism only applies to political life, to social life. It should apply to anything because it's a general point of view. So what are the limits of this? Are we saying, as long as things are in a certain way, if you adopt this point of view, it will give you a good result? Or are we saying it's like a metaphysics, like for anything, this is the 3 point of views that you need to take, right? So like, right, the limits also of the organizational point of view are undefined. And I think that we are pragmatic, like we don't care, we don't spend any time discussing, let's do biology and look at it from these angles and things like this, even though there is good examples of theoretical biologists that do something similar, like Rosen, but the kind of philosophical aspect of it is definitely something we haven't really spent much time on, right? Is it a general philosophy? Is it general just because we are not interested in defining the boundary? So it looks very general. We're looking down, not up, right? Regardless, like I do think it goes along with your question about the limits of this and so on. I also think that there is an open problem that is more practical, which is, on the one hand, it looks very practical. Like, I feel like it's useful to look at things in this way, but when I try to write about it, there is something to it that is not so obviously transmissible. Like, I feel like things clarify for me, but doesn't necessarily make it obvious for others, even though I'm not sure if it's, my own, I'm still chewing the idea, and it's not that's why not clear. Oh, it's a problem with the idea as well. But it's a weird thing. It's so abstract, but then it's because it's abstract, it's very malleable, so it's very applicable compared to other things. Not sure if anyone has a point here, or we should look at. I also, there's another issue, which I think is, what do we mean by difference? Right? In this definition, like, differences that make differences, difference that makes a difference, difference that can be made different. Like, there is a connection with information and Bateson and all those things. We never explored it very well. And also, what do we mean by equivalent, or these perspectives are the same? Like, what does the same mean there? I don't think it's like category theory, it's a bit weirder, it's a bit underexplored as well. I don't know how to remove this. Okay. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment more on this, or should look at another one.
I mean, I want to second that practical problem you just framed, Gabriel, insofar as, like, I can say for myself that this theory has really transformed how I think about things, but how to kind of transmit that usefulness, besides just kind of like, hey, trust us, you should learn some crazy math shit and it'll pay off. I think that's like a very real problem. Just want to second that.
Yeah, I wonder there, because fala, Fernando. Yeah, Fernando.
No, sorry, I was going to say the same thing. These days I was thinking that if we are building like a grammar that only us like are familiar with, because we feel like there's something there, but then we can't like transmit it in a way that someone that is not familiar with our work won't be able to catch up, etc. It's only something that I was thinking, and then you brought up, and I also brought up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say on that I think it's also important to note that I disagree that, or this part here requires mathematics. It doesn't. You can just talk about the fact that how things are structured has effects on what you get to interact with, and it has an effect on what resists that interaction and becomes meaningful. So, if your eyes are made of a certain composition, therefore you get to interact with light in certain ways, and this makes certain differences different, and other differences don't make a difference. They don't need mathematics to talk about this. On the one hand, just on John's point, even though broadly talking about the whole thing, yes, I think mathematics is important to us. And I also think, it's a task on us, not on the thing, to learn how to transmit it, right? Not every good idea will be obviously transmissible, and you need to find ways to transmit it. So that's part of the job. That's why it's good to know the questions that everyone has and things that are not clear, because we need to clarify them for ourselves so that we can transmit things to others. It's okay to be like that. Like, you need to learn, right? So I think that it's good to worry about it, but I think it's also a good thing that it's not immediately obvious, because if it was obvious, it would be something everyone already knows. But there might be ways of doing it that are better, right? My opinion is that the core idea behind this thing, that is the most useful thing, is to realize that, like, kind of what this thing defines is the idea of a sensor, right? It's a very general idea of what it means to sense something. That's perhaps where it connects to Bogdanov. Bogdanov was an organizational rationalist, but his theory starts with sensation and the idea that you need to be organized in some ways to sense some things, right? And he didn't make a distinction between individuals and collectives. So if you explore that division, you can ask, how can a collective sense something? And that these three things here are trying to explain that. They're saying, well, depends on what that organ is made of, it will be sensitive to some things that it will interact with, and some things it won't interact, right? So, for example, you are in a situation and you want to see what part of the situation is sensitive to something. Our intuition is that we can use our brain to connect things and say, well, everyone is affected by economic crisis, therefore everyone senses capital. What this theory is saying is that that's not true. You will sense prices going up. You will sense your neighbor is more stressed. But will you combine all those things and say that capital is affecting you? Not necessarily. If you are in a trade union and you are organized in a way that you see everyone's wage going down, going up, competition within your category being increased, you won't just say prices went up because you're sensing something different, right? So that idea that Bogdanov had about a knowledge is organized experience, and experience is organized sensation. There is something similar to that, right? That, well, but then depending on how things are organized, you sense things different and you experience things different, right? And we're expanding that to be clear for social world. So if you know, if your connections with your surrounding, if your institutional situation, with your political life, it's very individualized. Everything that happens in the world will appear to you through your individual channels. And you can rationalize in your mind that all of this is connected and it's all the fault of capital or all the fault of exploitation, but that's just a theory in your mind. It's different than if you're organized with people and you can sense things different, because everything will affect that whole thing, right? It's like there are waves on the sea. If you're a person just going up and down with the wave, you will just see that you go up and down. You won't feel much. If you are in a big boat, that captures many waves at once, for example, you will sense something different than mere, I saw more in the horizon and then I saw less, or something like this. So depending on how you're structured, you will interact with the environment in a different way, right? I think that's a very, very general intuition. I do think we speak little of it because it does have an intuitive power. But I think that my impression is that one of the biggest resistance against this idea is that it is an it goes against the mental reality of things, right? It's meant to substitute mental constructions for social sensibility, right? Something like that. It's meant to substitute how you bring everything together in your head for how something that is in the world connects with the rest of the world, but not your head. You can be thinking something totally different. So it's a weird idea. Like, I don't know. I think that there's a lot to discuss on this that we never really debated, but definitely the issue of how to make this idea more intuitive and transmissible is a big issue to debate.
Yeah, I also feel it's like it feels sometimes like when you describe it, it feels a bit sort of like inofensivo, like
Harmless.
harmless. But like once you put it like some common ways of talking about politics but not only politics, it's true, like but like, normally when you function like with representations and discourses, and this perspective forces you to sort of like ground like this every idea or meaning or concept becomes sort of like it has to be grounded in somewhere and some context which gives it sense, right? And this sort of effort, I think, like, so both the idea of representation in sort of like cognitive science and the idea of sort of like the way that representations like images and words are used in politics, you suddenly have to always ask like, okay, but where is that spoken? Where is that said? Like, what is it made of? Like, where is this happening? So there's this very like space, it sort of like forces space into like representations, which and like material. If yeah, I don't know if I'm clear, but like it forces talking about politics in a way that always localizes in sort of like material context stuff. And I think that's why it looks harmless, but it obliges you to do like work for like defining what you're talking about.
You want to see a good example of it? I mean, I think it even what you just said also justifies putting something here. I'm not sure if you agree, Renzo, but I think a good example of how to use this is the idea of perturbation, which is something like you're the one who actually brought up as how good perturbation or removing something and checking if it makes a difference, how good that is as a criteria for whether something exists for a system or not, right? So, for example, let's say you have an opinion about Russia's war on Ukraine, right? When you have a representation about that part of the world, again, it's a mental construction and so on, but it's a question of what would have to change in the Russian-Ukraine war for something to change in your world. And you might see that there is a huge divide, and inverse as well. What is it that you can actually do that makes you interact with the war in the Ukraine? And that might be very, very small. So even though in your head, you're very intensely connected and everything connects with everything, when you do the experiment of saying, okay, but what differences make a difference? Like the number of dead don't make a difference. You're not connected. Nothing, no signal that it matters in your world changes with that. You being for or against it. What decision do you take in your life that is different because of that? Right? What political decision will you make the next day that changes because of that? Well, you might not be friends with somebody or something like this. So you start going out of your head, which still has only, I mean, everyone has their opinions, of course, but you move out of it to make an analysis that what matters is the capacity to perturb or be perturbed by changes there, right? The signals that do matter in your decision-making and that don't matter in your decision-making, and how that scenario has something to do with how things are actually structured in your life. If you have family in Ukraine, that changes completely. If you're involved in a, act of solidarity, concrete solidarity with the people in Ukraine, that changes everything on that regard. Even if in your head you say, I don't have an opinion about the Ukraine war, now it matters, right? So the organizational point of view is constantly taking us out of our head and asking, okay, but regardless of what you're saying, is there actually a channel of connection between the object or the phenomena you're describing and the things you are able to influence and be influenced by? Or will it arrive to you via so many mediations, that if it's actually being caused by something else, not the war on Ukraine, but the price of rice in China, can you really tell those things apart? If things are getting more expensive where you live because of the war, or you just know that it's connected because you mentally constructed that connection, right? So I think that that tension is very relevant to that idea. Like, choosing a different point of view to map reality other than your head. So yeah, I'm not sure how I should add this idea here, but I got it from your description of intrinsic information and how do you call this when you try to remove a part to see? Is there a name for this operation?
Yeah, partition or cutting or
Uh,
disintegration. It's called like, yeah, look for the minimum information partition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, I think that the general idea is like perturbation or counterfactual, right? In the end, like perturbing being like, it's related to that Pearl guy, the Judea Pearl, which is like he changed a lot of like how probability and statistic works by pushing the idea that in order to learn beyond like correlations, making like causal statements of how like within models like variables can be said to cause others. There's no like description that by mere observation you can sort of like derive a causal model in which you can say like X caused Y, just by observing stuff. And I think, yeah, this is I think it's relevant for us. Like in his formalism, he basically shows that there's no amount of observation that's sufficient for you to make a statement about like causality of like some variable causing. You need to postulate some extra property, which is the ability to intervene in some system. So in his formalism, he introduces this operator called like a do operator, in which you sort of like within a model, you sort of like intervene in a variable and sort of, he does like causal surgery, that's like the name. And you can sort of like, you disconnect some stuff in your model and put it in a state, like you force some state and then you observe what happens. So say if you have like, I don't know, like light, like the correlation of like my light is normally on when like my neighbor's light is on, but yeah, they go together because it's night and then people turn on. But once you realize that there is like, you can sort of like destroy his light and your light is still on, or once you realize that there's like the switch, that once you interact with a switch, you understand how it relates to light. Otherwise, you could say the light causes the switch, but it's only when you manipulate and interact. So that's one thing, and the other is this, yeah, it's related to this counterfactual reasoning, which is like this idea of like asking what difference would something make, and so on. So I think it's all related, like this move from correlations and observations and towards perturbations and sort of like difference making, which is
yeah, I think it's very connected. So yeah, I'd say that this is I think that's where we took this idea more than the philosophy of it. Like, what does this mean about being or something? I think generally what we did is turn it into, again, a point of view, meaning you want to assess things from a point of view that allows you to distinguish connections you make in your head from connections you actually have in the world. That's, I think, where these things they matter, right? So you say, what if that thing was different? Would that change anything for you? The answer to that question won't agree with your opinion on how important something is, right? To start with the idea that, I mean, there are very, very few communists in the world, it doesn't affect people because they're not connected amongst themselves. If you had like a strong international and you're part of it, and then you say, what if there were no communists? Suddenly that makes a big difference. So, but that's a difference at a different level than the one in your head when you say this is an important thing. I think about it, I like it, I support it representationally, right? So I think it has It has that effort. And it also, you can ask the inverse question, which is, in this situation, what is the thing that is the most affected by the things I find important? So for example, I find the struggle with capital very relevant. It matters little to me as capital. It matters to me, like it changes my life in terms of prices, in terms of wages, in terms of things that connect to me. But there are other parts of the same situation where those fluctuations in composition of capital, competition levels, or whatever, they affect large connected groups, right? So that might be more meaningful as a point of view than yourself. So you can start making those distinctions as well. So I don't know. I think that generally that's how we've been using this. But I think that there is also one thing that is useful, just to bring it to the second one, because it clarifies something that is a big problem. We never speak about this, but in the order, like in the little story of STP, it appeared afterwards, but it explains how we got there, right? Because we developed this big diagram very early on, which we call the monster diagram. We have all the explanation for it and so on. But the answer to the question, like, how could we build this diagram? How do we know that social worlds, which is the W here, are built out of different logics that have to do with property, contracts, and value, right? Well, if this thing here is correct, we should be able to ask, from which perspective did we sense that value exists, right? What is the real thing that was happening that made it necessary to talk about value? Or what was the real thing that was happening that made it necessary to talk about the fact that people are organizing communities, that not everyone is included, or to talk about property as something that has some structure, right? And this is why we add the org here with the arrow going to these things. The idea being that, and here's the little explanation, that we can historicize, so we can understand the historical appearance of what a social world looks like by adding the question of which compositions, interactions made these logics and forms visible to begin with, right? And what we realize is that, well, you can explain, imagine that these arrows, like this is a big eye looking, and this arrows is what it interacted with, right? Well, struggle against capital from the standpoint of workers, struggle against exploitation, helps to clarify what value is. It's not for nothing that the guy who wrote the book on value theory was also one of the leaders of the Workers' International. The struggle against states helps to create a theory of the state. And we know this to be true because there is a profound connection, for example, between Hobbes writing the Leviathan as a reaction to the levelers movement and the Glorious Revolution and the revolutions against the crown. So again, you see political struggle coming before the big books on the topic that ultimately became the basis for understanding that this exists and this is a logic and this is something you can see, right? So, and the same goes for the history of, debating what communities are, the struggle against segregation. It comes after. I mean, you can even if anthropology is very useful for doing it, anthropologists were very aware that they were very mixed in a colonial debate. There was a struggle against colonialism and a struggle against oppression at the heart of the theories that we have today about what does it mean to organize in terms of communities around the gift and so on and so forth, right? I mean, if you want to take a recent example, even Derrida writing about the gift comes after the war with Algeria and France, that he was clearly trying to follow and theorize after the fact. What does oppression look like and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we're kind of obliged by our own theory. Because of this, we need to be able to explain the organizational history that would ever lead leftists to have a theory that the world is structured like this. No, the world looks structured like this because there is the composition interaction of political struggles with the world. And then the world resists those struggles. That makes the world intelligible to the struggle. Does that make sense, that idea? Again, we did very little on this.
Yeah, I mean, the same argument holds, I guess, for identifying them as three logics and not one, right? I mean, there's a whole story of trying to sort of like subsume one logic on the other one, and I think only like contemporary fracture, like non-aligned society, like again, it's like Brazil and so on, you get to see like this stuff appear in more like, it's only when you get to see it appear in non-aligned forms, you get to sort of like be able to give them irreduced autonomous places and connect them and see the unified version as the not the most general view. Before that, like there were like, it was a big problem for like theory, how to like, whether like class came first, then like the state and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, we can go into the logic, to the little drawing in the bottom when we get there in a bit. I would even say that you could have at this point here something less sophisticated here, right? It's almost like the basic thing we know is that people struggle against exploitation, people struggle against segregation, against expropriation, so against being the extraction of surplus value, against being shunned out of communities or even exterminated by being not fitting in a community, but also having their possessions removed from them. These three things are not the same, right? They can coincide sometimes, they can be different. I think what you just said, Renzo, even goes even further, right? Because we can even account for the fact that it's in a moment that by our own theory of peripherization, we're saying that these things don't match, right? Today, people who fight against segregation don't necessarily fight against exploitation. People who fight against expropriation don't necessarily fight against segregation. You can have movements that are fighting against expropriation of nature, but are fascists. Segregatory movements that are going to blame it on immigrants that we're losing green areas in Germany, right? So these things don't match. Because they don't match, we need a theory, or it becomes intelligible that they are three separate things. They're not just one thing, right? A lot of our theory, I think, fits in the little story that the left for a long time assumed that these things always overlap. And from the peripheries of the world, you see that they don't. And you see that practically, you don't see that theoretically. You see that because you try to do things and you don't get results in all those levels at the same time. And therefore, you now see that they are different. So again, the tritarianism is applied, right? So you can almost derive, like if you have org and you kind of have the peripherization thesis, if you don't want like a long history and the idea that we collect the results of this history in the books of political science that kind of fetishize the aggregate knowledge of political practice, right? Capital is kind of a consolidation of a lot of ideas that are already at play in the organization of people against exploitation. The Leviathan is explicitly a reactionary response, but at least a very smart one, to struggles against emptying the seat of power, right? And then Hobbes says, yeah, but even if it's empty, it's still the seat of power and so on, right? And again, fights against segregation and so on, they do raise the right of existence of alternative communities, which are not the modern communities and so on. So we could justify this on the way of the collected history of struggles leads us to recognize that there are all these different things, and now we need to see how they connect, if they can connect again. Or we can just say, right now, there are places in the world where it's obvious that they don't connect if you are engaged in organizational practice. So both ways you lead to this idea that there are 3 poles here rather than just one. And you can imagine that, let's say, the more these things are aligned, the more you would get like an arrow going straight from this big thing org to W, straight to the whole world as such, rather than to a part of that world, rather an aspect of that world. I think that one question that I have here that I think a lot of people raised, Caron raised this issue and others have raised, is should this symbol here, like what's the connection between this symbol, which is, let's say, every political experience which is resisting the worlds they're in, and the organizational point of view, because the organizational point of view seems to be too broad, right? To account for this. This could be substituted by the, communist point of view that is saying there are different struggles, but they are the same ultimately. So I need to be able to integrate what they see from this different structure. So yeah, I think that there is a bit of an issue about what is the relation between org and organizational point of view. Does that question make sense? I'm not sure if you guys are following.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I think one of the the useful things about the way we have the main, the organizational tritarianism diagram is it does let us not only just like be at a higher order than just politics and history, but also to try to understand different political formations without already having taken a side per se. Gives us a better way, I think, to map the political ecologies of the right or the center or whatever without necessarily having a quote position in it. But then of course, obviously we do have a position in it. So it's like there's an interesting tension there. And I am wondering if, because one of the things that you brought up early on, Gabriel, that was I've thought about a lot since then, is kind of like looking at the description of the communist militant in the Communist Manifesto as a kind of generic position. And it does seem like there's almost this kind of simple layer of like, which we've been talking a lot about in other contexts, like social space-time, that's the kind of place that the communist is positioned at, this kind of level of like looking across social space and looking down the road in social time. And there might be a kind of level there between the most abstract level of Trinitarianism that we can kind of tie into what makes like a communist and not just one other kind of political position.
Yeah, I think that's a big issue as well. Because you're right. I mean, one way that we named org at some point was the space of all possible ways of organizing, right? Which now we don't use that idea for anything. Like, I wonder if we need it as such, it would almost be like the infinite point behind this. You could have this as a more concrete thing, and that.
Yeah. I have a nerdy comment, like, what would it make sense? Like, because it feels like org is too far, but in the idea of like universal construction, you're trying to find like the closest point of view, which any point of view would have to factor treat, right? So I wonder if you could have like a diagram in which you have like org, and then some like communist point of view, which would be the sort of like
singular thing inside, right?
That sort of like factors and allows you to see all of the diagram. I don't know if it would make sense, but it feels like we need to distinguish this two levels, and I always also wondered about that.
That's a really intriguing way to formulate it. Because not only is it interesting from the perspective of like defining like the perspective of the militant, but it's also interesting like when you piece together like history after having been taught like bourgeois history, like you always see that the missing piece to make sense of the modern world is like the rise and suppression of communist movements. And there's this way that history only makes sense once you begin to factor in like that movement through history. So that's actually a really interesting way to kind of like tie together both the perspective of like a militant, but also the perspective on history from like a generic communist place or as a component in a larger thing. That's really intriguing.
Yeah, because I think that this answers this thing here, because just to clarify what that means, right? The way we drew this until now says something like this. You have a bunch of arrows, which are like movements that are either against capital, movements that are against segregation, movements that are against property. You might have even movements that are combined, which is reality, right? Most movements are organizing communities against capital, or disorganizing the elite, so fighting both capital and communities, or fighting, you know, the state with capital, and so on. So you have all sorts of movements. And the organizational point of view, which is this point of view that everything is actually organized, and you can see it from that point of view, it would put everything in the same realm. So it would unify everything. But it unifies everything in such an abstract level, because even if things had nothing to do with each other, they would still be unified, right? Because they're organized. Of course, they're organized. It's like saying everyone who breathes is part of the same. Okay, fine. It's so general that of course everyone will be part of that definition, right? I think what Renzo said is you could have an arrow that goes from this very broad point of view to something more special, which is the smallest, bigger thing. It's a mathematical way of defining something. The smallest, biggest thing that includes all the movements that are going on. And this is actually already known mathematical construction for defining in a singular way a perspective. And that perspective would be the perspective that agrees that everything is organized, but it's trying to name only the political movements rather than everything. And if you're trying to name every leftist political movement, but only the political movements and not naming other things that don't fit, because if you're just calling everything organized, all animals or all plants, all the planets, everything is part of that group. You want to reduce it only to political movements, but from the perspective of organization, that could be called the communist hypothesis, the idea that we care about the real movement, not the ideal movement. So it's about organization. We're not looking at what you have in your head, which is what the organizational point of view was doing, taking us out of the mental into effective process. But with the idea that all political movements are still part of the same group, even if they are doing different things, right? That would be the communist idea, the idea that they have something in common, which is they're fighting this common thing, even if they cannot see it from their perspective. You can only see what they're fighting when you see them as a whole. Right? That's kind of what the communist hypothesis is, even in the Communist Manifesto, right? So yeah, from that perspective, we could improve on this using that, I think. John, just a question, because would you say that is that fair to say the communist knows what is essential? Because wouldn't you say that people who are engaged on struggles are the ones who know what makes a difference for that struggle? Right? The communist would be somebody who needs to know how to bring together movements that, because going back here, they are composed differently, they interact differently, they therefore think that different things are important.
Well, yeah, I guess I left out, well, no, I didn't. Like, the idea has always been the essential link. So yeah, I do think the communist is the one that helps bring out the essential link. And that would be like, I mean, link is more of an internal metaphor as opposed to like smallest, what is that, the greatest lower bound, right? Like small, whatever, whichever one it is, but it's like a tightening thing, right? That's
Yeah,
the
no,
kind
it's
of
what you mean
idea
now.
that like, and this is all very like, you know, the Leninist kind of perspective on it, I guess, or my perspective on that. But like the idea that there's always a lot to be done. There's always a bunch of things to do, but how do you like tighten down, given what you have the capacity to do, onto the essential link of the moment? I do think that like communism is, I'm not saying like some ideal communist militant that's separate from the movement. I'm saying that the process of being a communist is learning how to pick that out in some ways, to in order precisely to link together movements, right? Which was always a kind of core criteria for Lenin in determining essential link. Does this build the movement as much as win a particular fight?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of what I mean. I know the word essential link is very ambiguous and why I prefer our tighter mathematical language, but also trying to make sense of, because one of the challenges I think is at least useful at times when engaging with other leftists and especially Marxists is to kind of show like how our theory can account for when Marxists have been right, not just wrong, right? Like to be able to explain why theories worked in certain situations. I think Marxism has actually largely failed at accounting for its own successes. It's been like, we won, and it's like, why? It's like, because the working class did a thing, and it's like, okay, but why did this particular theoretical framework at this time? Because it's failed so many other times. And I think we have a capacity to be more nuanced in analyzing how our mappings and strategies have been more or less successful. So that's all. This also ties into like trying to link our theory more to the kind of books like what is it called, the goal or the plan or whatever, everything from Amelia's presentation, because that's so much of what those texts are about, is like, we don't have infinite time. You have to make a choice of many things, and there's like a really close connection between our relationship to things like operations research and neoliberalism, and I think the kind of core Marxist militant challenge of like what Badiou in Theory of the Subject called thinking on your feet. You know, like you got to be able to keep your theory running while you're actually doing activist work. You can't tell the movement to like wait while you think. You definitely can't tell the reactionaries that. So yeah, anyway.
I wonder if that, I mean, that question seems to connect with the issue of how does strategy and tactic appear in our stuff, but perhaps it can appear better in a different, like here. I'll just wait a bit, because I think that the thing that makes this thing a bit clearer also is to know that it's, let's say, right, I would say the org here, it's just the black part, right? It's the sort of the idea that this kind of mouth on the world, right? It precedes knowing what you're chewing, so to speak, right? So you need the political kind of jaw to chew on the world, and then you see the pieces of the world, what they're made of, right? So the little apple here on the core, that's the monster that is being chewed. And I mean, I think that this, sorry, yeah.
Well, then maybe we should introduce the communist as a universal property, like Renzo's presenting, at the level of social mediations, because that would be where you would have the logic to construct it. I think, like, we can't construct it just at the level of org. We need this here to like have the capacity to tighten down to smallest, I think.
Yeah. So to connect that, so the idea, then we have an idea, which, so the first thing to learn from this is that in our current system, politics precedes epistemology, right? So social theory is a consequence of politics. And even if we do sound like a bunch of nerds, at least we do start from the presupposition that we are collecting, let's say, chewed pieces of previous struggles, right? So the idea that you do theory, then you do politics is not necessarily, it's not a built into this system. The system is actually built in the inverse presupposition. We can only say, look at value. It's such a problem in society because people have reason and they felt the pressure of something that they had to name. What is this thing that still organizes society, even though you can win a strike, or you can get your wages going up, or you can, take back a factory, or you can kill a capitalist? Why is it still working? You would only pose that question because you tried something against it. That principle is this principle here of tritarianism, right? That's what allows us to recognize that you could only make something intelligible because you're interacting, because you're organized in a certain way. So that's why the thing being made intelligible, which is the world, comes after all the struggles against it. Again, that's a Bogdanov principle. The idea that it's a very strange mixture between Lacan and Bogdanov, because Lacan has this famous statement, right, that the real is what resists symbolization. And Bogdanov has this statement where knowledge appears at what resists labor. Like the things that don't resist labor, don't resist your attempt to mold them, you don't even try to name them. Like they just go unsymbolized. They're already part of what you already know. It's the things that resist the laboring attempt to change them. They are the things you know are real, right? So there's something similar in this. Like through struggle, things resist, and now you name what they are. So this is how we get to the big diagram, right? It's our current take. There might be better ways of doing it, but it's our current take that tries to integrate the results of struggles all the way into the present. That's what this diagram is. This is a post-political diagram based on what has been done, not a pre-political diagram to then tell people what to do, right? So I'm just going to add a source thing to it because it has a clear source. Why is life so difficult?
Are you talking about guitar?
Yeah.
I put that
Okay.
on the other gray box if you just want to copy and paste it.
You already put it up. Perfect.
Yeah. But I didn't realize you made a source box, so you could just do it all.
No. I mean, whatever you guys can do. So yeah, so already added. Understood like 5 lines from. Which is Kojin Karatan. I think I can't write it. I know I can. What the fuck? What is going on? Okay, it's Renzo doing crazy.
Or it's me, I'm trying to divide it into.
Yeah, the 2 things we use for this are Kojin Karatani's book Structure of World History, where you will find him doing this first thing of saying that there are 3 modes and that they are combined. What the fuck? Okay, you're separating the 2. Sorry. And he says that they are structured like a Borromean knot. The gift economy, the value, and the gift economy, value, and property, right? And then we say, but what is a Borromean knot? And there are three sources for that. One is knot theory, where Borromean knots don't even exist for real because they're called Brownian links. They're not even knots. So Lacan got it totally wrong. And they are the trivialist thing. Nobody gives a shit about them. They're like stupid material. Then there is Lacan, who just writes about it, saying a bunch of things that make absolutely no formal sense. And then there is this mathematician called René Guittard, who actually tried to formalize what Lacan was talking about. And he created this structure. This is a Borromean structure written with arrows and things. So that's what's going on here. So this is actually a deformalization of Karatani's idea that mode A, B, and C form a Borromean knot. If you want to understand why this is a Borromean, you need to pay attention to the arrows. You see, the whole thing is constituted by the tree, so the arrows go into it. And if you want to remove something consistent from the core, you don't get back to the individuals. You need to get them 2 by 2. So that's the Borromean property. You take the tree nodes to create something consistent. And if you want to create consistent smaller parts, you need to take them 2 by 2. Right. So
I think it's also
two arrows become linked.
just worth noting as far as sources that most of the math we use is like definitely growing and more influential and blah, blah, blah. But this is probably our most niche reference because I don't think I've seen, there's no other like reference to this. No one's used it. Like it's everything rises and falls in terms of the categorical logic with this one essay.
Yeah.
I do propose at some point we go into it in some more detail because there's some other interesting stuff there.
Yeah, just to be clear, guys, if somebody publishes a text saying that this text is wrong, we can no longer use this. Like, this is the problem of using mathematics. Like, if somebody says, no, this is wrong, we will have to find something else. We won't lose everything, but any insight we get out of this will be wrong. So this is a problem with what we do, which makes it different from regular philosophy, which is we can be wrong. And on the side of
which is a good thing, right? Because
yeah,
eventually we'll learn not to waste our time on something and go to something better.
and also, I mean, if you can be wrong, that means you can also be right. So we have a chance of being right about something. I think that's the angle we should look at. I'm just adding here a bunch of books that justify the idea. It's not Karatani's, he's not the only person who thinks like this, that there are 3 modes that are articulated into every social formation. So Wallerstein's Introduction to World Systems Theory also says this, and Brodel also says this in his big book. Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation also says this. Diane Elson's theory of domestic, what does he call it? Is domestic production and contractual, I think, modes. They also have 3 modes that are always articulated. So in feminist theory, in world systems theory, in Karatani's crazy mind, a bunch of people are arguing in this direction. So we're not necessarily, at this point, we're not like Karatani fans. There's a tradition of people who think this way in both feminist social reproduction theory, world systems theory. Very much more respectable people like Karl Polanyi say this, Brodel, Wallerstein. So there is a long history of doing this, but we used Karatani to find a mathematical theory that would allow us to add these things like this. Okay. But there is a bunch. Yeah, sorry.
I don't know if we brought this up before, but also before writing the Leviathan, Hobbes was writing a trilogy on the 3 different aspects of society.
Fuck, there you go. Well, there's another person here, a very unknown person who, let me put this where it should. There's a very, very unknown person who wrote about this, called Hegel. You can find, for example, Reasoning History. You can find on the Philosophy of Right. You can find it in many places. That's where Karatani says the guy who thought that society was organized in a dialectical triadic thing where you had civil society, state, and culture. Civil society is where Hegel went to study economy, state, and the realm of culture, communitarian forms, and so on. So, I mean, there is a lot of precedence for this, right? But there's still, I mean, I'm just going to add the yellow thing here because there's a bunch of questions also. Yeah, these questions go here, right? I think for this diagram, because even if you accept, right, that it is meant to, the first thing that it's trying to do is not disclose the reality of everything. Let's say tomorrow we have a new political struggle that clearly, for example, shows that the logic of fight for information, the social logic of information sharing is neither value contract nor communitarian. It's a new thing. We would have to include it here, right? Because it would be revealed to be one of the aspects of what makes a society, right? Let's say all religions in the world create a weird ecumenical relation, internationalist, Islamic, Christian, Buddhist, international, that completely revolutionizes production and leads us to communism. Well, we will have to say that spiritual life was more materially organizing of society than we thought, and this will have to change. So again, this is not in our heads. Things can happen that would require this thing to change. It's just the best current model we have to allow everything we know to exist to be combined. And why would we want to combine all the political struggles we know to exist? Because we're communists. So that's the order of reasoning, not the inverse, right? But for example, some basic questions like, is guitar's diagram sound? I think that's a first question we haven't really discussed very much, right? What can we learn from the arrows, from the direction of the arrows, and from the some terms, right? Like A plus B, for example. It's something I think only John thus far has minimally discussed this in his presentation. The fact that look at this B plus C, you see that 3 arrows going into it, right? It exists. You can get to it from B. You're thinking about property, and you end up thinking about property plus value. You are trying to look at the world, and you end up extracting the connection between property and value. You try to think about value and end up thinking about property and value. So there are many ways in which you arrive at it. And there are no ways to directly arrive at the modes. Nothing leads you to them, right? So what does that mean? I mean, one thing that this could suggest is that it does take some weird creative leap to accept that these things in their pure form are relevant, because the closer you are to real social life, the more they are mixed, and the easier it is to find them mixed together, and it'd be hard to untangle them, right? To give just an example of this, which for me is the example that I always go to when I try to convince myself that this is the case. Everyone thinks that, or at least I did think that commodity exchange is a pure idea of capitalism, commodity exchange. But exchange, it's 2 things at the same time. It's a matter of people who own commodities alienating commodities, and it's a matter of only doing that if the value of the commodities is the same. So I say my commodity is worth $10. You have $10. Now we exchange, right? That my commodity is valued at $10 and that you have $10, that concerns the value of commodity. But that we exchanged and now you own my commodity and I have the $10, that concerns alienation of property. And that's not mode C, that's mode B. So one thing that looks like the logic of capital, which is the exchange of goods, in practice is actually a mixed thing. It's a mixture of property and commodity. If you were a commodity the Einstein example. Put yourself on the point of view of the light traveling. So put yourself in the point of view of a commodity. If you are in somebody's hand or somebody else's hand, it doesn't make a difference. It makes a difference for property owners who want to know what they possess. But for commodities, it doesn't make a difference because they're equivalent. $10 and your commodity. So you start being able to pick those things apart and also start thinking more clearly that sometimes you think you're talking about one thing, but you're talking about mixed things, right? So, but I think that this is, we have discussed this very little and we know very little about it. For example, Michael, who is not here, but who is writing a thesis on nationalism. One thing that he realized is that often we think we are discussing community, but we are actually discussing community mixed with state. So for example, why is it that Lacanians and a lot of contemporary philosophers, when they talk about community, they talk as if the community is like those who are inside versus those who are outside with no ambiguity, like identification, total identification. That's already a mixed thing because most communities are actually very plastic. For most of the groups that you're part of, you don't segregate people automatically. There are those who are inside, you have connections with those who are outside, and there are like strangers, guests, and things like that. It takes a kind of state-like territorial relation to be applied to communities to turn them into either you're in or you're out. So you can separate those two things and, for example, recuperate communitarian struggles and say that, for example, to believe that every communitarian struggle that is defending their community is silently being led to totalitarianism because they're a sect, a cult. They're going to try to, expel everyone who is different. That can be called racism, for example, because when it was a matter of, first world nations organizing themselves, they agreed that they were plastic, they can welcome people. But when powerless people try to organize, they should be careful not to form communities because that's leading to totalitarianism. So you can start separating those things a bit. So just to show that the orange parts here, they're very interesting to think about. How one logic influences how you see another, right? But we have done little work on that. Does this crazy diagram that we use make sense to people? Like, is anyone just lost by looking at it, or just the notation itself, like what it means each term? We added an explanation here, but perhaps it's still not clear. Sorry, John, I think I cut you off also.
Oh, that's fine. I just want to see if anyone had questions, but I think one of the things that comes up with the whole, the 3 T's don't have arrows coming into them is it's one of the places also where we really link up like the abstraction of Badiou's worlds and transcendentals with like our more concrete, because that gives us a kind of like mathematical picture of a transcendental, right? Like there's nothing going into a transcendental.
Sorry. Yeah. But you see, like, again, if you look at this, you say there's nothing coming into these 3 things, right? They're just postulated. But if you look back at this, now you have the arrows that go into them. You're saying you can only get a feel for what the logic of affinity is, the logic of value is, the logic of contract, because there is something struggling against them as such, right? Like in some level, anti-capitalist struggle is not just, I just realized that, what happened here? Is something weird, like, wasn't there a yellow thing here?
I think one of the times that you copy and pasted, you grab the original.
Oh, holy shit.
There's stuff.
I think, but I'm not sure.
Sorry, guys. No, I can add it. Yeah, that was it. I
I can't
dragged
even touch
everything.
the screens without deleting something accidentally. So I'm impressed that
Yes.
you're holding it together.
But you see, like, you guys see how these three things connect, right? This thing here is saying only how you forget what you think, the way you organize and the way that you interact with the world will tell you what really makes a difference for you. And that doesn't mean only you individually, it means you as part of bigger things. This diagram is saying that, well, you can only learn about these three black pure structures. We only learned about them because there were struggles against them. That's how we learned that they exist. So if you do an anti-capitalist struggle against exploitation, you're not just trying to make it better, less exploitation. You're against exploitation, organizing society. Well, that will lead you to ask, what is exploitation? And how can I tell if it still exists or doesn't exist? That's the only reason to write a book like Capital, right? If you don't care about exploitation, you only need a book about price. You don't need a book about value, the value form. You're sufficient with asking, how can we make prices better? Not how can we abolish the use of price, right? If you don't care about producing kind of international spaces or being able to translate between communities and recognizing that they're all legitimate, you wouldn't have any question about what is that forms a community in general. How do I recognize the legitimacy of every community, right? And if you don't care about abolishing private property, if you don't go against the sort of monopoly of contractual validity that the law creates, there's no reason to ask, what is the law? How do I recognize if I've abolished it or not, right? So we are trying to bind all those things in this diagram. And these authors we mentioned here, they help doing that a bit. And I think that this is the main line, like this is the backbone, and then everything kind of follows from it to the sides, right? Yeah. I wonder where we should go from here. Perhaps either here or here, right? I think that this is slightly less clear. This is a recent addition. In fact, this is something that Dennis worked on in the last paper. And I even think, I wonder if this is the right, if it should go here, or if this arrow should even go upper, because this arrow here, this thing here, which is, how do you define a social world, right? How do you know that you're talking about something that is social and not just worlds in general? That question has something to do with that issue that we raised with this early thing here, right? Well, the organizational tritarianism is so big, so general. How do you know how to apply it to social reality rather than to anything? Like how to close the scope just to the things that interest us, right? And here as well, like you can, I guess why the arrow comes from here. You're interacting with something. How do you tell apart what is the things we want to unify and we want to understand, which is social reality, from things which are not social but are part of it? So, you know, social reality is made up of a bunch of things: energy systems, ecological systems, you know, prey and predator relations between different animals, physical stuff that makes the world goes round, people's ideas, books, whatever. So how do we know that we're just talking about social transformation? And we only will talk about these other things insofar as they're connected with social life, right? I think that's kind of the idea that is behind this thing here. But to understand it, I think that you need to know kind of the sources behind it. Let me just try to copy both things at once. I'm sure this will turn very badly.
Yeah, but couldn't it still be between the first and the org diagram? Like, even though, like, he's like politically it might be otherwise, like logically it feels just more general than the org one, because it moves from the organizational point of view to the like socially organized point of view. So
It's a good question. Yeah, that's perhaps why we could perhaps add an arrow here. Oh my God, what did I just do? I'm really nervous about copying and pasting. Oh my God.
yeah, hold Control or Command, and then you can select individual stuff. That's like, did that work?
Yes. So how about this?
Yeah, but I feel like the arrow from the social world goes to the org. Like it's above in the hierarchy, but I'm not.
Yeah, the reason why I'm not sure is because why do you need to define this? Like this thing here is just saying political struggle comes before the how we are going to describe the world.
Okay, so that level, it's the social world is like a black box.
Yeah, at this point, it's kind of like a black box, right? We could even, that's why I said we could even remove this content here because it actually goes in here, right?
So it's more about like politics and social world, like more about the distinction between politics and social worlds.
Yeah, I think it is. At this point here, we're saying, okay, politics is we want to transform how things work. And we know that they have something to do with value, that they have something to do with gift, contracts, and so on. And I think that this thing here, I'm not sure, Dennis, perhaps you can jump in, but I have the impression that what this thing is trying to do is say, our technical machinery, it applies to too much. How do we define? So, for example, are we going to change the fact that people build bridges? No, building bridge is not social. Building bridge in a certain way, connected with something else for a certain purpose, and all these things are connected, that's social. So when you say you're going to change society, you're not saying that you're going to directly change an action or an activity. You're saying you're going to change some other thing, right? For example, building bridges, is it necessarily based on value, based on property, based on gift economy? No, it can be any of those things, right? So how do we separate the material stuff from the social form? That's the thing we want to look at, right? And this is kind of what this thing here is trying to do. It's saying like we can arrive at what social life means by a process of layers, of definitions, right? This very, very broad field here we took from Badiou. So let's say this drawing here is the first drawing that is saying, in our task as political militants, to map the world that we learned through political struggle, and to map every type of knowledge we got from political struggle into a unified model. Let's use Badiou's ideas. He got it right. That's the first time that this is coming into play, right? Using logics of worlds to define this logic that we want to change, and that we learn that it exists through political struggle. But then Badiou's term is too broad. Badiou doesn't define what social worlds are. And this is what this diagram is trying to do. It's trying to explain what needs to happen for you to be able to just think about social worlds. Or in other words, what does it mean for something to be social, right? So it starts with Badiou, but then we try to be more specific. And I think that the sources for this are still a bit they're not obvious. It's something that it's a mixture of Badiou, Bogdanovs, and even classic sociology. Because what this diagram is saying is, well, Badiou has this theory that worlds are made of a kind of logic that glues together parts and wholes. The whole thing defines what the part is, and the combination of parts defines what the whole is. We don't need to go into that now. But you can define more specific conditions for what those parts are and what that whole is, right? And what these principles are trying to suggest is that if you account for these things, you will get to a social world. So the first idea is that you need social systems are always connected to life. There is no social system of an inanimate thing. Purely inanimate relations don't make up social things. So the fact that you're trying to survive and reproduce your own form beyond the material that you consume, that's an essential thing. So that's what we call the principle of divergence. The fact that there's a minimal separation between the matter and the form, which is something you already see in every living phenomenon. Living creatures, they can exchange matter with the environment, but they remain who they are, right? The same cell, even though the material changed. The same people, even though all the cells change in life, right? So something needs to remain, even if the material changes. And then we said, well, but if you look at living systems, not every living system forms a society, but many do. And the way that we distinguished it was by saying, if you look at a living creature, the totality is a living system, and the parts are living parts. Those are the organs. If you look at an ecology or an ecosystem, the totality is not a living system. It's made up of living things, but the ecology itself is not an animal, right? And it's made up of living things. But why is that not a society? Because every living thing in an ecology is only doing actions to try to survive. And those actions, they relate, and they either facilitate or they make it harder for them to survive. Whereas in a society, that's not what we do. In society, every part is doing something different that doesn't guarantee their survival automatically. But only when you bring them all together do you get this. Sorry, Fatima, yes?
No, I just wanted to ask Renzo's question again, of using the social world atom relation diagram before the org, or yeah, I think at the beginning, because it feels like there's first this recognition of the social world that needs to be made, and then one can like take the communist point of view and like try to connect and disentangle the other struggles. I don't know if that makes sense. I clearly understood.
No, let me add this here. I think we should add it. How would you guys frame this question? Perhaps is the definition of social world something that comes after the communist, how do you call this, engagement with struggles, or is it a presupposition for the org diagram, something like this?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know if that's what Renzo was thinking about when he asked like a few minutes ago if we should move it to like at the top, or maybe between the organizational tritarianism and the message diagram on there.
Yeah. You know, now that I think of it, there's a good reason against it, though, because Badiou himself fits in this arrow, right? He's first a communist who wrote Logics of Worlds. So he wrote it because he wants to make Maoism rational, right? So in a certain sense, even for Badiou, I'd say that the fact that politics come first, and then you look at mathematics and you look at things and you say, look, this thing is real. I can give you guys more material to show, you know, how real it is. But I'm not. But I understand the point. I'm not clear on it either. I think that, I mean, I perhaps there's more at stake here than I thought, because you know, if you follow this definition to the end, what we ultimately are doing is saying social things, social worlds or social systems, they divide parts no longer based on what is good for their survival, but they make their survival interdependent on the whole. That's not what ecosystems do, right? From our understanding, that ecosystems, a bird is still trying to survive as a bird. It does birdie things, right? Dogs do doggy things. But if there's some synergy between what they're doing, it might make both of their survivals easier. What humans do is that dogs do mechanical things. Humans do weird things that don't guarantee their survival, like just your activity. You know, you build a bridge, you cannot eat a bridge. But if you do a bridge, you get paid with money, and somebody else who's, you know, planting wheat, you can buy the wheat and eat it. So it is kind of a version of division of labor, which is a classic sociology theory of, I think it's Durkheim, right? On division of labor as basis of society. That's also Engels' point. But it's slightly different because it's not based on labor, it's based on activities. So it's even more general. Even if for a hardcore Marxist, they would say, oh, but that's not labor. We can still claim that there's society there. And it's not anthropocentric because it accepts that, for example, ants form societies. Because the division of activities amongst ants, like a soldier ant, guardian ant or whatever, those are not divisions based on their individual survivals that then have synergy. Those are divisions akin to division of labor, right? If they just do the guarding or the soldier work, they won't survive. So they're attached to the whole in a different way. But I think that, again, this is an underexplored thing. Like we haven't really discussed how does this relate to social reproduction theory, for example, because this is a theory of social reproduction, right? That society exists where reproduction goes through other people. Individual reproduction requires a reproduction of others, and you're not capable of reproducing yourself by yourself, right? And how does it relate to the theory of division of labor? And I would also add, does it track with evolutionary biology and ecological theory? Because, I mean, we make that distinction with ecologists, perhaps it's a strong distinction, and in reality, is that not how that goes. So we should also check it, right? And I mean, that goes all the way here, what I said. So reproduction of life rather than matter, the fact that the synthesis of the whole space mediates individual survival. And then we added a third thing, which is the multiplicity principle, which is the idea that social worlds don't have one logic, right? Like you need to, because it needs to integrate everything we do, it will have to integrate physical exchange with other physical systems. And energy is much more intuitionistic than classical, or it will have to integrate symbolic exchange, which is kind of para-consistent. So how can it integrate all these different types of exchange or intercourse with the world? Well, because it will glue together as many logics as needed to guarantee that survival. So that would also explain why we have, you know, it's accommodating the fact that we have many logics, right? But I think that there's so many questions here. I think that we're still lagging behind on this. a lot. Like we introduced it very recently. We haven't really detailed very much about it. Even though I do think it's useful that we can make these distinctions, you know, like, for example, phenomena with many people where they are very independent of one another. That wouldn't be a social phenomenon. That could be like a collective phenomenon, a group phenomenon. But if your action is not in chain to somebody else's action, and your goals don't go through other people realizing they're separate, different goals, and so on, right? Almost like your immediate goal is completing a task, and your objective is surviving or reproducing whatever structure. And those two things have no alignment. Like, what does selling shoes in a store have to do with remaining alive? It has nothing to do. There's no version of selling a shoe that feeds you and protects you from the environment or anything. It has no connection, right? That separation between, that divergence between your immediate goal and your structural objective, right? What you produce and what's meant to be reproduced to that production, that's what would qualify something as social. And I think that there's also a good political merit to this, because a lot of things we call social when we're doing politics, like this is a social gathering, this is social because we're socialized. It's actually not social from the standpoint of how we use that category when we talk about social relations in capitalism. When we talk about social relations in capitalism, we're not talking about how people feel about each other, or even if we are in the same room, right? Like the fact that I rely on people farming in China and what happens to the farming of rice in China has something to do with my objective of remaining alive. And those two things are so totally separate, right? That's what makes this a social thing. And it is definitely distinguishable from ecology as well, and ecosystems. But just to know, Hans and Fatima, how would you do this instead? Like, you would put this box where, like here before this one, perhaps, or it would be on the side and then do this.
Yeah, like now hearing you explain more and more, I think it doesn't, I don't know, at least it doesn't make sense for it to be like a result of these two diagrams here. Instead, I'm not sure if I'm getting it right, but it's like this, I think this is Dennis box here. You can call it Dennis. So yeah, it seems like where we recognize a social world. So yeah, and the org diagram, it assumes that this social world has been already recognized, and then there's this, I don't know, analysis going on of social relations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I have the intuition that there should be a way of explaining this where it doesn't come before, because then it's weird that we just said that it takes some point of view to resist something so that you can see it. And then we say, yeah, but from there, you should get to this. But like how, my intuition is, how do we get to see division of labor as a question? By resistant division of labor, right? So that would be, the org would still have to be before the division of labor. But perhaps, you know, like perhaps this whole thing should come before this thing here. Like,
yeah, I would have an arrow at least from the social world to the monster diagram. I'm not sure. Yeah, which way though with the social world to org, which way should be, because yeah, I haven't made up my mind, but I feel like the monster diagram depends on the social world atom diagram, no?
Sorry, I'm having trouble. Yeah, but I mean, I
It
think that you
depends,
can have.
like, what kind, like, what type of arrow are the arrows?
Yeah, but I mean, I think you can get detailed things coming after the broad stroke things. Right? I mean, you don't need to know, otherwise you need the inverse. Like you need to know what alignment and atoms are, the logics are, the social atoms to even be able to build this thing. Because then what does it mean if you don't know those things? But like if you take this just to be, you know, the general logics, the mixed logics, and they form a world, but we don't know how to define the logic yet, then it could come before. But from what you guys are saying, I think that the correct way would be to erase this content, put here something like struggle for survival, you know, like social reproduction struggle. And then you get, before you know the modes, you would get the knowledge that there is something like social life, because you can change activities and society remains the same, right? That would explain why politically you arrive at the problem of what is society. And then you fill it in with, well, there actually combines many modes. See my point? Like perhaps what you guys are saying that it should go inside of this diagram.
Right, but in any case, don't you think the social world should point to the monster diagram or not?
Yeah, I think you're right. I was trying to add that arrow, but I moved the whole diagram.
Okay, let me, so wait,
Yeah, just
this,
put, yeah.
okay.
Because I mean, the basic thing here, if you want to politicize it more directly, is the fact that reproduction and transformation are not the same, right? Like the fact that to remain alive, for example, if you don't like what's going on in your life and you want to change it, you're going to run against something. What is the thing you're going to run against? It's not one specific person, one specific activity, because even if you surpass that activity, if you win against the police, there's still the property system that is the thing that gives the police their reason of being. So before you get to the content, you could say that you have that basic problem, you know?
There's actually like a nice feature of the diagram. I think it was not intentional, but because if we treat like the org, the first org diagram as this sort of like split relationship between politics and the world, or between reproduction and transformation. To the left, you get all like political thinking, because you get like the social mediation diagram, which is about like ecology, political ecology, and then what emancipation is. And then to the right is mostly like social theory, in the sense of like describing the social world. And then even like the boundary thing, it's the mixture of both, because you're actually talking about the interaction between politics and social. So it's nice that it's sort of like, it becomes very general. It's the organizational point of view, then it splits, because it's this principle of relating politics and epistemology and social theory. And then you have like, we have both like social theory, which of course comes from this movement of politics, but we also have political thinking on the other hand. Like there's this two big branches of work, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
I mean, it's just,
Yeah, all these things are more analytic, right? And all these things
Yeah.
are more programmatic, right?
yeah, exactly.
And I think what you and Fatima suggested would also do something very nice, which is, let's say we erase this here and we substitute it just for the fact that even before we can separate these into clear arrows, you get transformative processes and the world resisting.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
What is resisting? It's just structures of social reproduction, right? So it puts reproduction versus transformation at the core, and it makes it easier, for example, to add a kind of ecological agenda as a core problem, because transformation with reproduction, that's where it happens, right? You want to transform for life to be able to be possible, right? So I don't know, I guess that this could be redone with that perspective, and then like we would get a simplified version of this here, and then it can either go to the modes as kind of a more fleshed out way, or go to a theory of social worlds that is separate. You remove the politics and just take theory, and then that's why you go here. Which is what you're kind of saying, right? That this diagram here, it's like you have an arrow, you have a line here, right? Everything to the left is more political, everything to the right is more analytic about the world, right? Also on that line, I think I would add something which is not here, but that I think it's part of this thing. It's going to add to the monster diagram, which is we did a work that was really good. We never went back to it, but we did in the atlas give the suggestion that you can see how, since society is not the contrary of nature, on the contrary, it's an organization of nature, right? Because it's all about natural beings reproducing themselves, but their reproduction is tied to every other person's or every other animal's reproduction in a specific way. You can ask, how does nature appear for a social system? And we managed to suggest, which I think was very, very successful, that there are modes in which nature appear for each one of these transcendentals. And the idea is that the diagram for social constitution of nature. And the idea is that nature tends to appear to mode C as matter because of the logic of matter. It doesn't have bounds. It's just stuff that you can manipulate. It tends to appear to mode B as resource. So it's something you take, it's something that you use, but it has some form, right? And it tends to appear to mode A as a partner. So nature is something you negotiate with, you exchange things with nature, but it's anthropomorphized as a partner. So like animism treats nature as if every animal has a soul and it's actually somebody you engage with. And we do this all the time when any electric device breaks and you curse at it, you bring it back to mode A, like, why did you abandon me? And so on and so forth, right? And then we try to create like the composite modes as well. I think, I won't remember now, but mode A with mode C. So the idea of matter plus a partner, that's what's called today Gaia in the Gaia studies and like cosmopolitical ideas. The idea of matter plus a resource is the idea of planet, which is like materialistic, but it has a form to itself. And the idea of a partner, but who is also like a property, is the idea of Earth, which is like where you live, your home, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of derive the three main names for nature and the three basic logics in which it socially appears out of this diagram as well. So we can also include here different types of ecological political struggles today. They also fit. But again, we only wrote 4 pages on this and never developed. So it's just waiting for somebody who's interested. I ran this by Sabrina the other day. You know, Sabrina is very, very engaged with eco-socialism today. And she told me that if they had a concept of matter versus resource to separate how capital deals with nature versus how state deals, it would be very useful. And I told her to visit it. So yeah, but I just think it's useful to add, because if we put social reproduction here in, and our theory of social doesn't make a distinction between nature and non-nature, right? Then it makes sense that this is something which probably should have more to say about.
I did a mini diagram. I don't know if that's what we had in mind, but up in the yeah, to the side. Would that be like the mini version?
Yeah, I think yeah, I think so. It's cuter.
Yeah.
It definitely has a less threatening feel.
Yeah, for
Like-
presentation purposes, like,
But perhaps you could do what you said before, right? Between you have org and you have, yeah, it's before. No, you're right. I think ultimately we would need to have two steps, right? This thing here, and I think it should separate. Yeah, it's a very sad face. I think we should be able to make something like a broader thing that you also remove from, like you're separating social reproduction from something which is not social reproduction, right? From this standpoint, we should be able to see a difference. So I'm not sure exactly how we could write it, but yeah, definitely there's like worlds, and then there is like social worlds. And there's something about political struggle that should be able to separate that, right? So somebody says, I mean, this is a classic, right? Somebody turns to you and says, you want to take away our technology, you hate cell phones. And you say, like, it's not about your cell phone, it's about X, Y, and Z. That X, Y, and Z is about something about social worlds. It's not about specific things that exist inside the world, right? When you say, I don't want to change, what you're doing. It's about the logic in which this thing is inscribed. That what you're trying to bring to the fore is this difference, right? Not the particular thing, but the particular thing insofar as part of this other thing. So I think it's something like that. But now that I think of it, it should have this, and then you should have this as like the product of the combination of the two or something, right? You're going for a third round. Try to make it a happy face this time. Yeah, just put the arrow in the inverted. Now it's an open mouth.
wait, what would be the non-differentiated thing you said?
Yeah, I have no idea.
I don't know if it makes
Yeah,
sense. Like,
Yeah, but definitely something to make better. I think that it's already very productive that we at least get to that problem. Like, if you go in the order of steps, like you should say organizational point of view, you should say when you organize, you see something that resists organization, allows you to see some things. Well, before it shows you that there are multiple logics, it does show you that there is a tension between the organization for a better life, for example, and the structure of mere survival, something like this, right? Marx's idea is exactly that. That is that politics enters in the distinction between survival and living, right? It's also the Platonic answer that there is a difference between living and a good life. So there is something, and I also think, I mean, the only rational theory of the difference between survival and living that we have is Marxist. For biology, that's not a relevant distinction. Like, you can define survival as, living is just the individual and the species survives, or you can say survival is like the minimal version of living with the minimal conditions. But the idea that surviving is very different than living, because there's a bigger process you're part of that is not just your mere survival. That's a Marxist idea from the economic philosophical manuscripts.
I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to solve it now. It's good that it's open. Like, it's good stuff to do. right? I would even say perhaps that's a good way of distinguishing, right? So social behavior from political behavior. Social behavior is kind of where surviving and living are very similar. And political behavior is one where they're not similar at all. Like your deal diagram even looks a bit like this one, right? The core here. Yeah, so I mean, there is something there, I think. But definitely something we haven't really, it's something to think about. I think that the questions you guys raised here, they show that they're important questions. Like they already make us go in the new direction. I wonder if we should go to something more. I mean, it's already 8:30, or if we should either wrap it up or just go over some other more general point. Is it making sense thus far for people? Yeah, Renzo, what time is it there? You and Fatima are like, Fatima is even worse than you right now, but
Yeah, but I have like a very active sleep schedule, so like doesn't matter. I would still for like 2 hours before sleeping. But like
Fatima is a vampire, in other words. Yeah.
yeah. But Renzo like seems sleepy for like an hour or so. Then we turned off the lights.
That's why he's so sleepy that this is what the diagram ended up looking like.
Yeah.
Can you just put an arrow between these things, guys, and just be done with it?
But I think I struggle to sleep.
Yeah, I think we did do a lot. Like there's a lot of stuff here, and we could pick it up again later. I mean, I'd say that there's an obvious discussion to be had between the three of these, right? That this leads to many logics. These logics are these ones. And so on. So, I mean, and I can see that now we have a messiness about these arrows that we could solve. Perhaps it's something to do before we get back. And then there is, I think we should spend some time on this corner here. So, but probably those are separate meetings. We don't need to do that now. But do you guys feel like this is, oh, fucking, do you think that this is minimally clarifying? Like, for me, at least it is, but I wonder if, like Monica, Fernanda, you, Fatima, also people who weren't necessarily here when we were developing the basic stuff, like if it feels a bit more connected to each other, you know, these ideas.
It really feels like it was like, I'm sorry, I'm really tired also, but I'm going to try to speak in English. It's like you guys mapped out all the theory that and got to the point that, okay, what is changing now that you did this paper with the social words, etc., and like started to looking more into it. And it was like a class, like SCP class for me. I'm really fritando.
We should use the frying jargon in English. Like I'm fried over this.
The thing that you said about the ecological, like that is still hanging there, is on the atlas.
Yes, if you go here, if my internet works. It was Moscardi who wrote it. It's called Seeing Nature. And at the end of it, it has this nice diagram.
Oh, nice.
You see, it's the same thing. Back then, we used to write K instead of W, and we changed it afterwards. but it's the same diagram, and he tries to go one by one and showing how they connect and so on. So yeah, but we don't have much, like it's like 10 pages on this.
Yeah, it's just a starting point, but it's nice to know. And I think that if the tools, theoretical tools we have now, it will be really nice to go back to this. I'm going to arrange some time to do this.
Yeah, let's talk also, because I was thinking of adding this to a presentation soon on environment. So we could talk about it.
Yeah,
One thing that I also, one thing I never realized until today is that, you know, this definition of social life that we were talking about now, it really is not, it doesn't make, like, people complain that a lot of definitions about society they require 3 levels. Social, there is nature, there is culture, and once you separated the two, then you have society. So only humans have culture, therefore they're only social animals. No other animals are social, right? Or we don't even include animals in our concept of society. This theory of society, it doesn't do that, right? It doesn't do that on 2 realms, because society is a way of organizing nature and life, but not everything that is living is organized in that way. And second, it also borrows from the Marxist theory of division of labor, because division of labor was good on one side, because it said, look, not every creature divides labor in the social sense of you do a task, I do a task. We only survive if we both do our tasks. That's not like an animal that is eating inside the mouth of a shark. It's just eating its own food. The shark is hunting their own food. You're not hunting for the animal, for the little parasite, right? It's not exactly that type of relation. So you can divide just like division of labor does, separating some things are social, some are not, but you don't do the division in a human exceptionalist way where, well, it's human, it's labor, therefore it's social, because a lot of Marxists associate labor with humanity so close together that, well, because other animals don't labor, they cannot form societies, right? So we uncouple labor from the division of activities, and then we are able to make a definition of social life that is not necessarily human, even though it doesn't apply to everything, which is the other problem. A lot of people who say we need to get over that definition of social life will then say that, you know, starfish in the bottom of the ocean are in a society with the water. Like, okay, that's such a vague idea of society, that everything is in society with everything else, and then you can't use it for anything. So it's interesting that we manage, I mean, it should be able to please, you know, the new ecological discourse that is trying to get rid of human exceptionalism, but it still is not like barata voa, the flight of the cockroach. It's still not like anything is valid, right? Sorry, it's a very Brazilian thing. But yeah, we should do more work on that. Like, it's totally under explained right now. Yeah, so I would also add those concerns here. Also, Renzo, there's this little thing living lonely here on the corner. We should probably see if there's, if you already want to add this somehow. And we should probably try to add here, right, an explanation of this diagram, and an I'll add one to this one.
I also thought that I mean, it's condensed in the diagram I added, but the distinction between experiments and investigations, it might connect to, like, there were like presentations. I mean, it's not something that we went back to many times, so I don't know if it should figure, but there's like a whole branch of STP that talks about like the idea of political experiments is very relevant. And we also had meetings on like concept of investigation.
Yeah. I
I
think you should
still
probably
think-
go somewhere here.
Yeah, I still think there are different things, so it would be
Yeah.
nice to map that. But it's condensed like there. I don't know if it's, and I mean I'm saying that because also John mentioned the thing about like the more like militant work and the distinctions there.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
I
I
think
think,
that probably we could add something here. Yeah.
And the other thing, anticipating, is because when I proposed the boundary thing, I was thinking about like how politics and the social world interacts. So I was more
Mhm.
concerned about like the org versus world distinction, and how like how do you think about this interaction through like a boundary? But then afterwards, with the three logic things, you made the bridge through the concept of boundary in tree logic, so it became like a broader concept, like it not a broader, but it also concerned the right side of the diagram, right? When I was thinking about it, I was
Mhm.
thinking about writing the interface, but the boundary is not just about like how a political body and the world interacts. It's a more general concept that in like a tree logic thing, it has to be sort of like, it's very interesting to specify it in the, so it's also interesting to
Mhm.
do that. But yeah,
Yeah, it's funny because it does. There's a good reason why it's centered here ultimately, right?
yeah,
It does look like it's the first theory of struggle we tried. What does it mean to struggle? But then at the same time that it was meant to explain like a very specific thing that this thing doesn't cover, it does is the closest thing to the topology aspect of these logics, right? So it's that type of coincidence that makes it look like there is like actual structure behind things. Like,
yeah,
yeah, but I guess, I mean, I think it's a good place to stop where we are right now. So, I mean, it looks like we have, if we were to be as detailed as we were today, we would have like a meeting about this to cover these open questions. One meeting probably about this, and already including this a bit, and then probably a separate one on the thesis here at the bottom. But guys, it would be good. I mean, we can try later to make sure everyone has access to this, because if anything appears, you should be able to just come and write it on this yellow thing. You know, you just click and add. So this way we can add questions and stuff, and later on we can try to come up with project. This will be very useful if we do get somebody to do research coordination and things like this, or if you're thinking of what could I explore if I want to present on something, you know. Just go by going through these questions, you can find like interactions between your interests and other people's concerns. So should make it easier.
It was awesome, guys. Thank you very much.
It was great.
Yeah.
Everyone,
Thank
have some sleep.
you.
See you later. Everyone's so tired.
bye guys,
Bye.
bye everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.